Yours.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Happy to see we have such a good turnout tonight. So, let me get these open. Tonight's topic is managing your child's ADHD. And I am your presenter, Camille Hereth. I've been a counselor for about a decade, working primarily with social services, women, and families. And I've also been a foster home licenser for a number of years, a foster parent myself, and then also have three children. And I'm also a trauma-informed caregiving specialist for Alliance Cares. So if you need support with your kids, I can be that help for you. So what we're going to be talking about today, here's our agenda. First, identifying what it is ADHD and how it's diagnosed. Using a strength-based approach, we're going to first talk about what are the positives, or what I like to call the superpowers of ADHD. What are the common challenges that come with ADHD? And then all of the support that um, these kids need to have, how to have support at school, support at home, socially, and then support for you as the caregiver. So, ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, is categorized into inattentiveness and hyperactivity impulsivity. It's now the only diagnosis that's given. Used to be ADHD or ADD, but now ADHD is the umbrella for all of it. It's a neurological disorder, also known as a neurological difference. Typically, people with neurological disorders have other co-occurring, typical, commonly known co-occurring neurological disorders are autism, learning disabilities like dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia. There's lots more, but those are the more common ones. Also, having a higher IQ is a neurological difference. It's hereditary to have a neurological disorder, which means that if biological mom or dad have it, then the child has an increased chance of having it, or blood relative. Substance abuse in utero significantly increases the incidence of ADHD, and specifically, I want to mention opioid addiction is the highest incidence connected to diagnosis of ADHD in children. So with all the fentanyl use we're seeing right now, that's very relevant. And then it affects the brain function. It has a significant difference in how a person is reasoning, the use of judgment, and the use of self-control. And then there's a range and severity, as is the case with most neurological disorders, mild, moderate, and then severe. And then we want to review primary diagnostic symptoms. So first, and they do look different for boys and girls. There's a lot of crossover that are the same, but I think it's important to highlight how it can be different in boys and girls because statistically, boys are more often diagnosed early on, and then girls are diagnosed more often later on, later years, or even into adulthood. So in girls, and because we have different learning styles, I always like to read off everything on the screen. I also know there's people that are taking care of kids and can't look at the screen right now. So primary diagnostic symptoms we're going to see in girls is going to be anxiety. Anxiety and ADHD really go hand in hand. I'll talk later about why that is. Academic underachievement. For some kids, this actually drives them to be more perfectionist, hyper-focused, and so they can be very good students. But with the girls, they tend to not have that diagnosis and they don't have the support in place, so it is more often leading to academic underachievement. There's careless mistakes made in home and at school, difficulty paying attention, zoning out when being spoken to, not following through on things like chores, schoolwork, work, commands, and tasks. Oftentimes struggles with organization, poor time management, and this looks like time blindness, where they just lose track of time and they're unaware. Oftentimes, Just difficulty keeping track of time and telling time can be there as well. Avoidance of tasks that require focus, losing things often, easily distracted. And easily distracted can be from the lack of focus. Forgetting things often, no matter how important it is. Internalizing emotions, which then leads to low self-esteem and self-image. And then we look at the primary diagnostic symptoms in boys. So these ones, you often see the hyperactivity more in the boys, which is why it's easier to diagnose them earlier. So we see the fidgeting, the tapping, the squirming, difficulty waiting their turn, interrupting others' activities, conversations, taking over without permission in any of those areas, blurting out rather than waiting their turn, careless mistakes in home and at school, difficulty staying seated, forgetting things often, no matter how important it is, difficulty with organization, constantly on the go, just really doesn't sit down very long for much at all, inability or struggle to play quietly unless they're hyper-focused on something, talking excessively, externalizing behavior can look like aggression, antisocial, and fights. And this can be indicative of anxiety. For boys, anxiety can really look more like aggression and hostility, anger. So there's a lot of overlap, but these are just more primarily what those diagnostic symptoms tend to look like based on gender, birth assigned gender. So in order to get diagnosed with ADHD, a child must have or individual must have at least 6 of those symptoms starting before the age of 12 and last for at least 6 months. And then they can be mild to severe at home, school, or with peers. When an evaluator is diagnosing, they typically will use something called a BASC-3. That's the diagnostic tool. And they'll give a copy of the evaluation typically to their parents or caregiver, the school, and then to the child if I think they're over 7. And typically kids are not, the provider isn't going to diagnose ADHD until bare minimum is going to be 4 years old. Because before then there's a lot of other factors. So some other common symptoms for boys and girls are going to be different processing speed, hyperfocusing, sleep problems, tiredness, stemming. And stemming is where they will repeat the same action over and over and over and over and over again. And sometimes it can be a behavior too. And then echolalia, which is where they will make a certain noise and then they'll repeat it over and over and over again in various different ways, different times, not necessarily over and over again at that one moment. They might just do it once that moment and then again 2 minutes later and then 3 hours later. It's like a self-soothing activity that they do. So an example would be going like, "Free," just randomly a noise, and then they will continue to make that noise in different ways, different times. So how do we diagnose ADHD? We can be diagnosed in a pediatrician's office just by you sharing the symptoms and severity and how long it's been occurring. What best practice is a psychologist, psychiatrist, or a neuropsychologist because they will do a more thorough evaluation. Like I talked about doing that BASC-3, the pediatrician is not going to do a BASC-3. It's going to be an evaluation based on observation and input. But the other types of providers are going to get feedback from the caregivers, the teachers, and the child, as well as assess for other co-occurring disorders or contributing factors for symptoms, which is important for wraparound support and whole holistic care of the child. Another reason it's important to get diagnosed by a psychologist, psychiatrist, or neuropsychologist is because there are other things that can look like ADHD. The most common ones are going to be a sleep disorder, like sleep apnea, substance abuse or withdrawals, medication from other diagnoses, environmental changes that could be taking place, and then trauma. Trauma and ADHD present very, very similarly. I did a training last year actually comparing the differences between ADHD and trauma and how to pull those two things apart. And then also undetected learning disabilities can also present as ADHD. So that's why it's important to get a diagnosis from someone who is going to do a full comprehensive evaluation so that we are making sure that the diagnosis is accurate. It's not uncommon, it's actually really common that if someone has a neurological disorder, they will have others that impact their overall function. So if you get the ADHD diagnosis, but you don't have the other co-occurring disorders that could be there, like let's say the pediatrician gives the diagnosis, then you're potentially not creating the whole child and may not be seeing the improvement you're looking for because let's say they got diagnosed with ADHD from pediatrician, but then there's also something like dyslexia going on, which is a reading and writing learning disability. And so you do these interventions for ADHD, but things are only kind of improving in school because you don't have all of the information. You don't know that that child also has dyslexia. So it's really important to get those full comprehensive evaluations to make sure you're getting all of the information there. I had mentioned some of the other common neurological disorders, dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, sensory processing disorder, autism, IQ differences. There's more. Those are the common ones. And then again, it's not common for anxiety and or depression to be co-occurring, which would also be identified when you do a full comprehensive eval. ADHD and anxiety, they're like best friends. They typically go together. So we also want to make sure that we're screening for that. It can be harder to detect the anxiety with the boys because it presents as aggression, irritation, hostility. So that might not clue all pediatricians in as, oh, this is anxiety. But those full comprehensive evals dig a lot deeper into what's going on. Something else to know about neuropsych evals is that they also look at like sleep history, they look at medical history, they look at a lot of other factors that could impact function. And so more likely that you're getting an accurate diagnosis. So if a child has been diagnosed when in your care, be sure to keep documentation of that, where they got it, provide copies to the social worker, and keep any good documentation of concerns that you have so it can easily and readily be shared with the team and any interventions that have been done. The reason I say that is because as I've worked in social services for 18 years doing in-home counseling with a lot of foster kids, and I've seen a lot of times where a provider will say something like, oh, she is acting like she has anxiety, or anxiety is clearly playing a role here. And then because that word is used, it sticks with the child. And so now all of a sudden they have a diagnosis of anxiety. Or if a provider says something like they're acting like they have ADHD, or clearly they have ADHD, and then it sticks. And so if they don't have that diagnosis, but because someone said it, it can follow them. And so we just really want to make sure that we're having that documentation if they have or have not been diagnosed with something when evaluated. So I love to focus on first, what are the special things about having ADHD? What are the superpowers? If you're here, you probably know that it comes with a lot of challenges. And we really want to be able to recognize the really beautiful things about the minds of people that have ADHD. So number one, they tend to be outside of the box thinkers. They can really look at something in a way that neurotypical people can't. And they can bring a lot to a conversation and problem solving with the way that they can think. They tend to be creative and really innovative. That's what allows them to be those outside of the box thinkers. The hyper focusing that they do, so while they have a hard time paying attention, also if they're interested in something, they hyper focus, meaning it's almost like obsessive, like they just really can dial down on something. And this can allow for high productivity at that time. a much deeper understanding of things and exceptional results with that one thing that they're specifically hyper focused on. For some kids, that one thing can last for a long period of time. It can be a short period of time, but they can really learn a lot about whatever that topic is. If it's a if it's a subject of interest, sometimes the hyper focus can be on subjects, people, places, things that can change. People with ADHD oftentimes they have that higher energy and they can be spontaneous and that can be fun and exciting and like the fun person in the room. They oftentimes tend to be more resilient because they're just more forward moving, forward tracking. And so they're just bouncing towards the next thing. Oftentimes more willing to take risks because that prefrontal cortex, which is the front of the brain where ADHD impacts their brain function the most, doesn't have as much of that judgment in place, which allows them to take more of the risks. But that can definitely be seen as a superpower of theirs. And they can be super engaging in conversations. They have a lot of thoughts and a lot to share. And so, yeah, really engaging, really insightful conversations. Um, and then we want to think about, like, I know you all might have your own struggles with having a child in your home with ADHD. We also want to think about it from their perspective, though. So these kids, they struggle with impulse control. And oftentimes they don't understand why they can't control their behaviors, but they're also oftentimes aware that they're not able to control their behaviors. So they may say something like, I knew I should have stopped talking when I was in class, and I just couldn't help myself. I just had to share my thoughts with my friend. Like they were very important. I had to share. They cannot wait to raise their hand to get the thought out. It just blurts out, even though they know in their mind, I have to wait my turn. I need to raise my hand. Oftentimes it really feels like they don't have a choice. They are not able to. They often can feel embarrassed because of the frequency they need reminders to do the same thing, or how often they don't hear the commands that are given to them, or they hear them, but we go back to this impulsivity, they do it anyways. And so what oftentimes happens with caregivers is they say things like, I've already told you this 100 times. Why do I have to say it again? Or what do you mean you didn't hear me? I've said it to you 4 times today. What do you mean you didn't hear me? And so they feel embarrassed. They emotionally dysregulate easily. This looks like low frustration tolerance. So they get frustrated and there's just these big outbursts at ages when you think should no longer be happening at that age. Like we're past the toddler tantrums, we're past the preschool tantrums. They're 8, 9, 10, 15 years old, and we're still seeing these big explosions because that frustration tolerance is just much lower. It looks like emotional outbursts. They will struggle with waiting and taking turns. That's very typical developmentally for kids that are toddlers and preschoolers. But when you have ADHD, this happens well into the late teen years, maybe even into adulthood. So think of that internal battle that's constantly happening where they're aware of their environment that, oh, other kids don't do that, but then they have that eruptive behavior or they struggle with waiting their turn and they know that that's not looking the same as what their peers do, but they can't help themselves. And then that impulsivity can lead to social rejection and embarrassment for them again. And so it's a real struggle. No matter how much they may want to keep it controlled, they really struggle to do that. Depending on how much intervention they've had, how much support they've had to gain the tools to offset what they're naturally defaulted towards. They're often aware that they struggle in ways that others don't, which heightens their anxiety because they don't want to be different. And this is one of the huge contributors to why anxiety and ADHD tend to go hand in hand. We don't live in a world that it's developed or designed for neurologically different individuals. We live in a world that's very much designed for neurotypical people. Our education system largely speaks to that. And so they have that awareness that they're different and their function is different. And so things that are easy for other kids are much harder for them. And so that anxiety is just constantly there or easily triggered. Because of all this, they often experience a lot of shame. They know that they've been told 10 times to do something that someone else maybe only needed to be told once. They know that they have these emotional outbursts. They know that they can see on their caregivers' faces the disappointment, the frustration, all of those negative emotions that come with the things mentioned above. I'm just checking the chat real quick. Okay. No questions. Oops. They're often very critical of themselves. So that internal dialogue is going to sound like, why can't I keep it together? What's wrong with me? Why are they laughing at me? Why don't I have a lot of friends? Why do I have to be told so many times? I'm so stupid. I'm so dumb. I don't understand things. That internal dialogue is oftentimes very negative. And you'll get a good indicator of what their internal dialogue is based on how they speak about others, what kind of ways they reference others is usually how they tend to think about themselves. So an example would be like, Bob, you're so stupid, you can't figure that out. Even though no one in your home, none of the caregivers would ever say to a child, you're so stupid. But if the child with ADHD is saying that, they're probably getting that kind of language from their own internal thoughts. So that's definitely something to pay attention to. And then so with ADHD, they tend to either sensory seek or sensory avoid. They can have a preference for one or the other or can alternate between both. And when we get kids entering the teen years, this can make them more sexually active earlier and then have more sexual activity if they're one of those sensory seeking. And so that's another component that becomes a struggle for kids because maybe they logically understand that's not safe behavior, that's high risk behavior, but they don't have the emotional regulation to stop because that's a sensory experience that physically feels good, but emotionally they know that's not good for me. So then that can lead to more shame. That's oftentimes the loop they get in of doing something they know they shouldn't, they do it anyways, emotional dysregulation occurs, and then the shame, and it's just a loop. These are the 3 areas we're going to cover tonight on areas that kids struggle. So the first one we're going to look at is school. When managing long-term projects, oftentimes that looks like multi-step projects. They struggle with staying in their seat. Elementary school is when that is typically brought up the most. They struggle with paying attention, talking out of turn in class, so they're speaking out without raising their hand. And then there's emotional outbursts when dysregulated or overstimulated. So school is an environment that we don't have much control over what that environment looks like for the kids. And so if there's a lot of stimulation going on, it's a large classroom, they're moving between classes based on elementary, middle, or high school, where they're at in their education system. This overstimulation piece can play a huge role in their function, their emotional regulation. And if they don't have the language to say, there's too much going on, I'm totally flooded, I'm overwhelmed, I need to take a break, then it's going to be those big outbursts. And oftentimes when there's different social pieces going on that they don't understand, they're going to feel really stressed, overwhelmed. That can lead to the dysregulation. Multi-step projects. So if you think in terms of like high school or middle school, there's a project they have to giving a presentation about the state of Washington, and they have to map out, let's say, 5 different places they want to stay and activities to do in each place. And when there's a lot of steps like that, it becomes really hard for them to keep things put together. And so the things that are asked of everyone else can be very difficult. And then at home, things like following routines, completing chores that are being asked of them to do, getting ready in the morning, positive interactions with siblings. Those are all going to be common struggles for kids with ADHD. Completing chores, even one chore like go brush your teeth. People with ADHD have short working memory doesn't function well. So what that means is if you tell them to brush their teeth and you're in the kitchen and the bathroom is on the other side of the house, by the time they get to the bathroom, they've already been distracted by something else and forgotten what they were supposed to be doing. And then 45 minutes later, you're like, why didn't you brush your teeth when they got engrossed in something else? You remind them, brush your teeth, and then they go to do it, and then maybe they get distracted by something else on the way, and something that should be just one thing, like brushing their teeth, can take up to an hour or more. So that tracks with this long-term project, multi-step thing. So if you said to a child, brush your teeth, get your pajamas on, and pick out a book, it gets even harder. So, and then social skills is the third area where we see the greatest challenges for kids with ADHD, making and keeping friends due to impulsive or intrusive behavior, and they can struggle to accurately read social cues. So those are the three areas we're going to focus on tonight on tips for support. So first, school. So when you have a child who has been diagnosed with ADHD, you're going to want to make sure that the teacher has information about ADHD. I've heard from countless teachers that they get little to zero education around neurological disorders. You would think that they do, because a very large part of our population has neurological differences, but they just don't. And so we can't assume that they understand what that means and how that's going to impact the child's function in the classroom. Or if they have accurate information. You might ask them, do you know what ADHD is? And they'll be like, oh yeah, totally, absolutely. But it could be not correct. A website that I recommend is understood.org. It has great definitions of all different types of neurological differences that impact kids in school. And you can just print it out, and it's a great visual for the teacher. Hey, I'm glad you've heard of it. I just want to make sure to provide this to you so that you have clear information. And then I always recommend meeting with a teacher at the beginning of the school year so that you can discuss challenges with them, what challenges the child has, and also what works well. If they have a 504 or IEP, then you want to make sure that they have a copy of that. You cannot assume that they do, especially once they get to middle school and high school. It's not uncommon that the 504 IEP won't be emailed out to the teachers until a couple weeks to a month into class. Sometimes it gets overlooked. And that's a really important document for the educators to have to know how to work with your child. I also recommend making sure that your child has a copy of the 504 and the IEP. The 504, you can just have the whole document in there. For the IEP, I recommend having the accommodations page. They just have a copy of it in their backpack, and you go over it with them and make sure they know if they're not getting an accommodation met. They can very kindly and respectfully say to the teacher, hey, I know you said my assignment is late, but this accommodation right here says that I get no penalty for turning in work late because of the forgetfulness that they tend to have. Or if there's multi-step processes for turning things in, it's almost a guarantee that the ADHD child isn't going to get it turned in on time. An example I see of when this happens often is in high school. If kids are in a school district where a lot of the work is being done on the computer, there will be teachers who will give the paper assignment. The kid will do the homework on the paper assignment, and then they're supposed to take a picture of it to submit online. Well, the kid then can't remember if they submit it online, or in their brain, I completed the assignment, it's done, right? Or some teachers, sometimes they turn it online, sometimes they turn the actual paper document into the teacher, and it's hard for them to remember when they did what. And so that's where an accommodation of no penalty late assignments would be really helpful. So talking to the teacher, going over this with them, making sure your child has a copy of their accommodations. Make sure that in the 504 and IEP that you have things there that you know work well at home so that there's a lot of carryover and that increases the chance of success. So if you know at home, if you have to ask your child, brush your teeth, put your pajamas on, and get a book for bed, you know that it has to be broken down to be successful. And so you're only going to give one thing at a time. You can have an accommodation like that in the IEP or 504, for example. And it really can be worded, just like this. Multi-step projects are broken down into one step at a time, checked for verbal understanding. Um, your accommodation should be specific and as broad as needed. And know that there's no limit to how many there can be. I've worked with thousands and thousands of foster kids in their IEP meetings, and I've seen some districts who have said, like, oh, five's enough accommodations. We don't need more than that. But it's important for you to know you can have 20 accommodations in there if that's what it takes. There should never be a cap put on it. I've never seen an IEP with 30, but if that's what you think you need for the child to be successful, then that's important and valuable information. So, um, I'll give an example of a specific accommodation would be something like the child is able to use a hand signal to the teacher to identify when they need what I like to call a brain break, which is when they're overstimulated and they need to step out of the classroom for a couple minutes. That's very specific. And broad can be something like the example I gave of homework assignments can be turned in. That's not limited to just math assignments. That's not limited to just tests or homework. That's pretty broad across the board. Another thing that's important to know is you can call an IEP meeting anytime to adjust the document or discuss needs not being met. So if your child is continuously reporting that I'm turning in my assignments, but I'm still getting penalized for getting them in a day late or whatever, and you've emailed the teacher, hey, just a reminder, and they're not adjusting the score or the grade, then that would very much warrant a call for an IEP meeting, a 504 meeting to say, hey, let's look at the grades that reflects this and why is this accommodation not being met? Or let's say your child has been in counseling and you have learned some coping strategies that work really well for regulation and you want to add some of those into the document. Absolutely worth having that meeting to make sure it's added in. You also want to use rewards and routines to reinforce at home what needs to happen at school. So, for example, if you know that a child is going to get math homework every single day, then you're going to help them come up with a routine. Okay, you get home at 3, homework will always be at 4, and you'll always get a stick of gum for sitting down and doing it at 4 and getting it done. We'll talk later about using rewards and routines. And then during the elementary years, specifically, the communication with the school team really should be very frequent. By middle school, there's more of an expectation that the kids are advocating more for themselves, and a lot more of that communication is happening between them and their teacher. By then, they're starting to learn how to email their teacher. By high school, they very much should be the one emailing their teacher, driving that communication, going to their case manager to ask for support. And if they are not getting those needs met, then you absolutely should be looping yourself into the conversation. Middle school, one thing you can encourage them to do is start to practice emailing their teachers and then CCing you on the email so that teacher knows like you're sitting in with that process. Um, and then something that's really important for helping with school. So people with ADHD tend to really, really struggle with organization, organizing their thoughts, organizing their space, their notebooks, their backpacks. So the more organizational tips you can give them early on, the more you're going to help them succeed. There is a class in middle school and high school for kids that have IEPs that sometimes if you have a good case manager at a good school district, they will implement organization into the IEP and really work on teaching them those skills. But some of the things you can do at home are teaching them to use sticky notes, to write themselves little reminders of things, because remember, forgetfulness is a big piece. Teaching them to write lists, whether they do that on a piece of paper or they do it in their phone. I like to recommend that they use both because in class in a lot of schools they can't have their phone out. So I doubt the teacher is going to care that they want to get their phone out to write something on their list to remember. And then by the time class is over, they'll forget. So maybe the sticky notes are the things they want to put on their phone list later, or just also having multiple different places they're having those reminders, teaching them how to use a planner and also using timers. So a great way to support kids with timers is looking at their schedule for the day or the next day, planning ahead. You're helping them set timers and then putting a label to the timer. So if Jimmy needs to do his math homework every day at 4 o'clock, you're making sure he's setting his timer for 4 o'clock. It says math homework to give him that reminder. Ideally, you would also be giving those transition warnings and those verbal reminders, but you're trying to teach them things. They're going to be lifelong skills to combat that challenge they have with organization and remembering things. The biggest piece with helping kids with school, specifically the middle school and high school years, is the forgetfulness, the forgetting of turning things in, the forgetting to bring home tools they need to complete the homework, the forgetting of the computer charger, the forgetting of an off the wall thing they had to do to get points, forgetting to bring home the permission slip to get signed. Forgetfulness is one of the biggest obstacles to overcome for kids with ADHD in middle school and high school. And so the more you can really have accommodations in their 504 or IEP to allow them to strengthen that skill without penalty, and then also teaching them these skills of using sticky notes, lists, planners, timers is going to be very helpful. There's some teachers and even caregivers who have this mentality of using a natural consequence. Well, if you forget enough times and get a bad grade, then you're going to learn. That is not what happens with ADHD. They can forget 10 million times and get all Fs, and it will not change their brain function. This is their brain function. It's not a lack of caring, a lack of importance. So natural consequences like that will not work to teach these children. It's really important to understand that. So how do we help? So number one thing is to use effective commands. So if you have a child in your care that has ADHD and you've had kids in your care that haven't had ADHD, then you understand that these kids do in fact need more commands. You're going to be giving them more direction than kids who don't have it. And that can get very frustrating for the parents and get very frustrating for the kids. And oftentimes, if you're constantly giving them commands, it can lead to them just kind of tuning you out because it feels like that's all they're hearing. And so they just stop listening. So we want to make sure that the commands we are using are effective, so we don't need to use them as much. So here's a couple different strategies for making sure you are using effective commands. The first is using an if-then command. So if they ask to do something and you know that getting them to put their backpack away is really hard, you can say, if you put your backpack away, then you can have that ice cream. So there's incentive for them. There's buy-in for them. You also know if you have a child with ADHD, these kids are very persistent. They can hyper focus on things they want. They really want that ice cream. Can I have ice cream? Can I have ice cream? Can I have ice cream? Yes. If you put your backpack away, then you can have ice cream. This also takes pressure off of you. Yeah, you can have ice cream. Absolutely, you can have ice cream after that's done. And then another way to say the same thing is a when then command. So when you put your backpack away, then you can have ice cream. When you brush your teeth, then you can watch a show. When you do this thing, then you get that. So it incentivizes them to get that thing done. That ordinarily, if you're saying it to them over and over and over again, they're going to get distracted. They're going to forget. They're going to not care. They're going to, oh yeah, in a minute. And then in a minute, they have forgotten. I mean, that's oftentimes what happens with these kids is they just forget, no matter how many times you've said it to them. So if you give something for them that's incentivizing and they're focused on it, more likely to get that thing accomplished and then less commands. Another effective command is using a choice command. So you can do it or I can do it for you. You can register for your classes so that you can choose what classes you have next semester, or I'm going to do it for you, and then you're going to get whatever electives I pick. You choose. You can also combine that with a when then command. You can start with a when then command. When you register for your classes, then you can pick out what we have for dinner. Or when you register for classes, then you can turn the TV on. But choice commands are another strategy for reducing the number of commands because it's more effective. Also making sure that you're not using choice commands. So if you say to your child, can you pick up your toys before dinner? You just ask them a question as though they have a choice. So in their head, they might think, no, I don't want to. And then you might come back at them and say, I told you to pick up your toys before dinner. And they're like, no, you didn't. You asked me if I wanted to, and I didn't want to, so I didn't. So being very, very clear and direct in your commands, asking no questions. Another trap parents can fall into is using a we command. So for let's pick up your toys. So they hear you're doing it with them, but you only want to do that if you plan on doing it with them, because then they're going to be looking for when you're doing it. And if you're not doing it, then they're not going to do it either. And so then they fail. One thing to know that is really supportive for kids that have ADHD is they will often do better at focusing on a task if they have you next to them. So by sitting with them while they're doing these tasks that are hard for them to focus on, like picking up toys, they're going to have an increased chance of success if they know that they have your support of being right there with them. You don't even necessarily need to be doing it with them, but at least your presence of being there. There's actually a term for that, and I forget what it's called, but it's a very real thing. So some different examples of when that might happen would be when they're cleaning their room. You're just going to offer your support of being there with them and talking to them while they're doing it. Or let's clean your room, meaning you and them, and you're doing it with them. So you're modeling for them what it looks like, but you're also helping keeping them focused in on task. This is really important for a lot of kids to feel supported in doing something that's hard for them. Someone said it's called body doubling. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, two people said it. Okay. Also, for all kids benefit from this, using the transition command. So you're saying to them, okay, in 5 minutes, we're going to clean up for dinner. That's a transition command. You're letting them know how much time is left and then what's going to happen next. And I always recommend actually using a timer. Kids with ADHD will oftentimes do better with more than just the 5-minute command and more than just the one command. Especially if it's something they're hyper focused on, they're going to really struggle with ending that task if it's a high preference activity. And so they may need a 10-minute transition command, a 5-minute, a 1 minute, and then also letting them know when they can do it again. They're just going to need more support with that transition. Um, the next area that can be really supportive for kids at home with ADHD is routine. Having routines will reduce the number of commands given as well. Having really good routines in many different parts of the day. So remember how they struggle with multi-step tasks? So rather than just a morning routine, for these kids, you might need to break it down more. There's a getting ready routine. That is getting dressed, brushing their teeth, grabbing their backpack. And then there's their breakfast routine. Um, eating the breakfast, making the breakfast, eating the breakfast, putting the bowl, putting it away. Yeah, that lives in your home. But and then there's going to be the after school routine. For neurotypical kids, that could be enough. Just after school includes everything from the minute they get home until bedtime, or until at least after dinner time. For these kids, their routines need to be broken down more. So there's the after school routine, there's the when to do homework routine, there's the where do we fit chores into that? What part of the evening is that? There's the get ready for bed routine, and then there is the actual bedtime routine. So just really breaking it down, making sure that you're breaking down larger tasks. And an example of that is cleaning the room. So neurotypical kids, you can maybe just say, one of your chores is clean your room, time to go clean your room. Done. These kids, no, needs to be broken down more. So first step is pick up your laundry. What will happen often is you tell them to clean their room, they go to their room. They're so overwhelmed, they don't know where to start, or they just get distracted by all the things. So you give them a starting point. Okay, first pick up your laundry, and then once that's done, you ask them to come check in with you. Okay, now your laundry gets put in the laundry room. Like you tell them what to do next. They come check in with you. Great. Now let's go pick up the garbage. Keeping in mind if you're using let's, you're supporting them with it. Um, so picking up the garbage and then throwing it away. And then depending on how messy the room is or the child, you might even need to break down the toys even more. So all the toys with wheels, let's do that next. And then all the rest of the toys. And then make the bed. Like you really have to break things down for them for success. And a task as large as cleaning up the room is going to be one of those ones where they're probably going to do better with body doubling, but definitely need it broken down more. This is an example of why parenting these children is exhausting and a lot more work than neurotypical kids. It just is because it requires so much more effort to get things done. It can be so easy to just either get angry with them or just they forget about it, and then they're not learning those life skills that are important. So, um, also making sure you're taking time for yourself and also making sure that the child is taking time to have quiet time in a way that's framed positively. So I like to encourage families to come up with an area in the home that can be used as timeout. Timeout can sometimes have a negative connotation for some people, and we don't want to use timeout as a negative thing. We want to frame it as a very positive thing. And so coming up with if timeout feels punitive, then calling it a quiet time place, but having the child pick a place in the home where they can go, they can be by themselves. These kids get overstimulated pretty easily. And so this is a place they can go to kind of calm down if there's a lot going on in the home, or if they had a big day at school. You'll often see these kids when they come home from school, they are so dysregulated. Like they are just all over the place because they've had to work so hard all day long to keep it together. And then they get to the safe place at home and they just fall apart. And so that's another example of when you could use that quiet time place or that timeout place.
Eat
Again,
it.
it framed in a positive way. Um, and then you can model the same thing for your kids too. So you can let them know, hey, I have a quiet time area too, and it's my room, and this is when I use it, and this is why I use it. And I recommend, with the child, you're identifying the quiet time area, how to use it, what kind of things do we want to have in that area, things that they know would be calming and soothing to them. So for some kids, it's like squishy toys. For some kids, it's having a lot of pillows, things with soft texture. For some kids, it can be like slime or silly putty. For some kids, it can be bringing an animal with them. I mean, it's different for everyone, but having a blanket that's really comforting to them, but just making sure that there's things they can do to help them regulate. Um, and then other tools to help at home. So we want to use praise very liberally. It can be really hard to find things that kids with ADHD are doing well, because they oftentimes need so much redirection and refocus, and it can be hard to see anything they're doing right. But we want to focus on praising the process and looking for perfection. And keep in mind, for every one negative comment you give, you need 10 to offset that. So if we think about that as a piggy bank, if you're only depositing 1 penny for every 10 you're taking out, there's a deficit, right? And that's what leads to that negative self-talk, that shame about themselves, that negative self-image, because they're constantly hearing what they're doing wrong. So we need to really work to offset that and to teach them to have those positive thoughts about themselves. And they're only going to do that if they're hearing that kind of feedback from you. So be looking for anything they're doing well. If they're just walking alongside a sibling or another child in your home without touching them and irritating them, that's something to praise. Wow, you're doing such a good job keeping your hands to yourself. Neurotypical kid probably wouldn't need that kind of feedback. These kids absolutely do, because that impulse control is very hard. So something as simple as walking next to another child and not touching them is, in fact, challenging for them. Another thing you can do to support at home is use what we call spontaneous rewards. So that's when you're offering a reward in the moment they're doing something well and something is hard for them, but you don't tell them ahead of time they're going to earn this reward. So maybe Jimmy, when the timer went off for 4 o'clock to do his homework, he sat down and did it. And even though he's like complaining the whole way, like, oh my gosh, I really don't want to be doing this. This is so stupid. I have to do it. But he actually sits down to do it. Oh my gosh, you did such a good job sitting down and doing your homework at 4 o'clock. I'm so impressed with you. I know you don't want to do it, but look, you're doing it. Nice job. And so we're ignoring that whining because look, they're actually doing it. And so then we can give what we call tangible or intangible rewards. An intangible reward is something that's not physical you're giving them, like a hug or a high five, or more screen time. And then a tangible reward is going to be something like a Tic Tac or some M&Ms, a little piece of candy, something small. And we don't want them to expect it, but we definitely want to offer those rewards. That's going to really reinforce that behavior that's hard for them. And then you want to be paying attention to the stimulation in their environment and look for behaviors that are caused from overstimulation or understimulation, and then adjust to support that behavior. So people with ADHD tend to be dopamine seeking. They tend to seek that thing that gives them excitement. So if there's not enough going on in their environment, they're going to start to look for things to give them something to do, which oftentimes will look like annoying behaviors, like picking on other kids in the home and doing things they know that are going to irritate you or make you upset, and they're just looking for stimulation. So is there certain periods of the day or certain times of the day where they are doing that sensory seeking, and how can you offset that? Planning ahead. And then if they're overstimulated, they can get really amped up in their behaviors too. And so if you tend to know when they come home from school, they're way overstimulated, how can you provide an environment for them to help them calm down? What are some things that are soothing to them to reduce the stimulation going on in their brains and in their bodies. Isn't going to be a bath, a shower, listening to music, going to their room alone for a while, going on a drive with you and just talking, like whatever needs to happen to bring that stimulation down for them. And then the last thing for helping at home is going to be focusing on the positive opposite. So you really want to focus on what you want them to do. If you want them to be walking in the house, you're going to tell them, walking feet, please. You're not going to say, don't run, because then they hear running. You focus on what you want them to do. Another example is stop hitting. Stop hitting your brother. I told you not to hit. All they're hearing is hitting, 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 hitting. It reinforces it. But if you say, gentle hands, please, and show them how to touch gently, then you're telling them what needs to happen, and that's what they're hearing is what needs to happen. Also reframing it as a positive is also giving more of that positive feedback for them, less of that negative talk that they get a lot of, tend to. Okay, then we want to help them with their social skills because that's often challenging for these kids. They will oftentimes make decisions with their peer groups that has negative consequences. So one thing we can do, especially when they're younger, is coordinate friend activities to facilitate those friendship interactions. So inviting friends to come over to the house and you're just kind of monitoring and supervising, or inviting friends to meet you somewhere in the community, like Chuck E. Cheese. I don't even know if that's still around, but somewhere like that, so that you can monitor and you can model for them how to have positive interactions with the kids. And then at home, just everyday interactions, talking about what does it mean to be a good friend when they're giving feedback about things that happen at school. Oh, do you think that's a good friend? Do you think that makes that person a good friend? What does make a good friend? And when you're seeing them having, kind feedback to others, even if it's just siblings at home, oh, you're that's like a good friend. A good friend does things like that. Like you're highlighting what a good friend does. Practice teaching empathy. A lot of times these kids can look like they don't have empathy. Empathy is something that people with autism can struggle to have. That's different than ADHD, and those can tend to go hand in hand. But in ADHD, it's not that they don't have empathy, it's just that they struggle with reading some social cues. And so we might need to teach them what empathy looks like and how to show it. So in this picture right here, I have this kid smashing someone else in the face with a cupcake, and he seems to be smiling, but that's totally something a kid with ADHD would do. Just like grab a cupcake and smush it into another kid's face and think it's totally fine. What's the big deal? Like, why is he crying? Why is he upset? Why doesn't he like that? Like, really doesn't understand why someone might not like that. And so it's not that they a lack of empathy, it's a lack of understanding social cues. Another thing that can be helpful is using a feelings cue card. That's like those magnets where there's like a square and they can put it around the feeling or the emotion that they're feeling, but you can also use it with friends. Like, how is your friend feeling when you describe that situation, to try to help them cue into that. You can get those on Amazon for super cheap. And then teaching social and emotional skills with social emotional coaching. So what this looks like and sounds like is just labeling emotions all the time, labeling their emotions, labeling your emotions, so they become emotionally intelligent. That really will help with increasing those social skills. And then practicing at home what good social skills look like, and labeling at home what good social skills look like, and modeling it. And when you're modeling it, you're saying it out loud. It oftentimes can feel silly for people to say out loud what's obvious to them, but this is a way we can teach them to not, where they're not feeling bad about themselves. So instead of waiting for when they're not doing it right, you are just vocalizing when you are doing it to just model for them, this is the expected behavior. So an example would be um, if you made a pie together and you say, I'm going to give you the first piece of pie because I really care about you. That's what good friends do. Something like that. Like that's a social skill of sharing, right? And showing that you care. And so just saying something like that out loud. Um, when we are supporting kids with ADHD, we want to use what we call a multi-systems approach. And that's when we're using a lot of different types of interventions at school and at home. And so making sure that the interventions we're doing at home and school are similar. The interventions we're doing at school are supporting the level of ADHD they have and how much it's impacting their function at school. Mental health counseling is one component for ADHD that can be beneficial for some people. It's them coping strategies, friendship skills, things like that. For some people, they choose to use medication. There is medication you can take to help with ADHD. When we're using a multi-system approach, when I talk about ADHD, there's no cure for it, and there's no one solution. You really need to be using a wraparound approach and using a lot of different tools to help manage it. Medication alone is not going to make it better. Diet alone is not going to make it better. So none of these things alone are going to be supportive. It needs to be a combination of things. So more things that can be supportive aside from the ones I mentioned are going to be also looking at their diet. Is there certain things you're noticing that might cause stimulation or like I know that red dyes in general for a lot of kids can amp them up. So maybe cutting that out. Exercise is crucial for these kids. They need to find a way to get the energy out in a productive, constructive way. Having adequate stimulation, like I mentioned before, they will start sensory seeking if they don't have enough stimulation in their environment. And so just be monitoring, is it too much? Is it too little? Having enough sleep, very, very important. Um, and reducing screen time. Kids with ADHD typically can respond to screens differently than neurotypical kids. They're more prone to that addictive behavior of the screens. The screens can really overstimulate them, or it can just make them kind of numbed out to other types of stimulation. And so the screens really very, very closely need to be monitored for these kids. And then how to support yourself. So it's really important to understand the causation of ADHD, just the function. Just understand, why do they have it? What does it look like? What parts of their function comes from ADHD? And to know that they cannot help this. They cannot help that this is how their brain is wired. They are not doing this to you. They are not trying to be forgetful. They're not trying to get overstimulated easily. They're not trying to pick on you or someone else in the home to make you upset or angry. They're doing what their brain is wired to do. They're not trying to be forgetful or dysregulate. This is just how they're wired, and we need to find ways to support them. Another thing could be supportive for you is identify the behaviors they do that are overstimulating to you. These kids typically take up a lot of space in the home. They make a lot of noise. They leave a lot of messes everywhere. Because they move from thing to thing to thing to thing to thing. And so what overstimulates you? Is it the noise? Is it the extra clutter? Is it the constant need for more commands? Like, what is it about it so that you can, in moments you needed, take that space from whatever it is that's overstimulating you, and then learn when to take a step back and find ways to create space for you to do it in that moment as needed. Apologize for when you do lose control. It's almost impossible to not have those moments of just feeling totally overwhelmed with these kids because they do need more work and more support. So don't be afraid to say them. I'm sorry I lost my cool. I was overwhelmed, especially when we've got kids that are just talking, 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 or those messes all over the house, or just need so much help and support in school all the time. Just apologize. Setting a good, apologizing to kids is setting a great example for them. Create opportunities for time away as regularly as you need, which can change based on the child's age and their needs. So time away looks different for everybody. For some people, it looks like I just need to go to the grocery store without any kids. For some people, that looks like they need to go on a walk where there's nobody else. For some people, it looks like a girls' weekend away or dad's hunting trip or dad's weekend away with his friends. Like it looks different for everybody, and the frequency is really going to be based on what's going on with the child. And then just normalize with yourself. Know that it is harder to take care of a child that has neurological differences. It just is. People that have kids that don't have 504s and IEPs and have these additional needs, they don't have those extra elements built into their day. And so just know that and let that be validating to you. And implement things into your environment that can have a calming effect on you to help offset that stress. So having music playing in the background or textures in your environment that are soothing to you, having visuals that are calming to you, maybe like quotes up in certain places to just remind you of certain things that are coping strategies, coping thoughts. And how do you support others in the home? The ones that are not the caregivers, I'm thinking along the lines of other kids in the home. It's important to educate everyone age appropriately on what ADHD is. There's a website called How to ADHD. It's a fantastic YouTube channel that has quick videos that just explains the function and explains why they do certain things. And some of them are really funny and they're very relatable. And why do they make a lot of noise? And why are they really messy? And just find ways to help educate so everyone understands. And this allows you to identify the ADHD behaviors rather than labeling the child and making them feel bad about who they are. So this is a really important piece to take away that shame piece for the kids. So if a child is needing a lot of reminders to pick something up, saying something to normalize that it's challenging for them. I know your ADHD brain is just really getting in the way right now. Instead of, why can't you do this? Um, look for hyperfixation on other children in the home and create protective factors if it's problematic. So I have seen where the hyperfixation will be on a child and another child in the home, and then it becomes really harmful to the other child that the ADHD kid keeps messing with them, keeps flicking them, keeps playing practical jokes on them to the point where it becomes almost like it can become almost obsessive. So you just want to be careful of that and intervene if that becomes the case. And then normalize that different children have different treatment, consequences, etc., because everyone is different. So if a child that has ADHD needs 3 reminders and a parent to actually walk with them to do something, but your neurotypical kid, for them, you say, if I have to give you more than 3 reminders, you're having a consequence, then they might say, oh, that's not fair. But it is fair because everyone's brains are different and just normalize that. An example I gave is if someone's allergic to peanuts and you made peanut butter and jelly for lunch, that would not mean that the person with the allergy should be expected to eat it like the rest of the kids. It's that same concept. Shaming these kids into submission is not going to work. And then normalizing that it can be exhausting and difficult to have extra stimulation in the home and create space for other kids to have quiet time that is enriching for them and validate everyone's experiences because it can be a lot of extra having kids with ADHD, and for neurotypical kids and even other neurologically diverse kids, they can be overstimulating, and it's okay to normalize that. Um, and then how to help at home. Some other thoughts are be familiar with the IEP or 504. If there's one in place, you can be consistent at home with behavior support that's being provided at school. Um, know the signs and symptoms of ADHD and the trauma that they're going to have innately because they have come out of a home that was not healthy or safe for them, right? And know to not take it personally. Using reward systems, incentive charts, keep them up in a few different areas of the home for visual reminders. ADHD and trauma both result in short working memory. Give yourself that time out. Use your team of experts. Make sure to rely on others that are supportive of them. Taking a parenting class that specifically supports children and or caregivers of children with ADHD. One of the programs that I teach is called the Incredible Years that research-based has shown is very supportive of kids that have ADHD, autism, oppositional defiance disorder. And then again, just looking for more ways to praise. So that's the end of the presentation. I was gonna ask some questions and also list